The story of Joseph is definitely fascinating with the emotional roller coaster that we see him go on from the pit to the palace to the prison, and then now in his position of second in authority to only to Pharaoh. And yet, the story isn't just about Joseph. The story actually reveals the change in the hearts of the brothers. Our reading today in Genesis chapter 42 through 44 reveals for us the significant change that these brothers went through. An overview of the story shows us that the famine in chapter 42, it says the famine had become very severe in the land. And as the brothers are told by Jacob, why are you sitting around just looking around? I need you to go to Egypt and get the food that has been reserved for everyone surrounding this land. And so they make their trip to Egypt. Now, we don't know if they knew that Joseph had made the way all the way to Egypt. We just know that they sold him into the hand of the Ishmaelites. But can you imagine? What if they did? What if they knew that he had been taken all the way to Egypt? When they hear that term, that name, Egypt, what emotions would that bring up for them? 20 years has passed just about, and they have concealed this lie, this terrible tragedy of selling their brother, letting their father think that he had just died, and now they have to go to Egypt. Now, whether they knew that Joseph was in Egypt, prison or whatever, we don't know. But we definitely know that they would have never guessed that he would be the ruler that they would have to go to in order to get the food for their father and their household. And yet this is exactly where they end up. Joseph recognizes them immediately. Now, from our reading, we understand that they put a translator there to make it seem as if Joseph could not understand their conversations. But Joseph puts them through several tests, not out of spite, not to injure them or harm them, but to find out, had these men actually changed? And God ordained this through the hand of Joseph to bring about this type of restoration that would take place at the end of the book. But Joseph puts them through the test. First, the test of honesty, to find out, as their word, is it going to be true? And so they declare that they do have a younger brother, Benjamin, at home. And Joseph says, well, you're spies, and I will not know if you're spies unless you bring Benjamin to me. And so the brothers have to go back home, but they do so without one of the brothers, Simeon. We find that Simeon is bound, and as the brothers return home with money back in their sacks, they get home and they tell their father Jacob that Simeon has been bound and put in prison, and that they cannot have him unless Benjamin comes with them, Joseph's younger brother. Well, time goes on. In fact, enough time where they would actually say we could have made the trip twice now, but time continues on, and the famine gets even worse, according to chapter 43. And Judah says, Jacob says, you must go get more food. And Judah says he's not going to let us get food unless we bring Benjamin with us. Jacob makes a remark earlier in chapter 42, but around this same line, he says, what is this that God has done to us? The brothers have asked that, and then Jacob then responds, why did you treat me so badly by telling the man whether you still had another brother? Jacob's response of why did you treat me so badly is a direct contrast to the fact that Joseph never complained, never asked this question. Jacob, of course, broken over the loss of Joseph earlier in his life. Now Simeon put in prison, makes no attempt to get Simeon out, and yet not wanting to send Benjamin to with the possibility that he might lose him forever. Jacob's question: why did you treat me so badly? When Joseph responds later on in Genesis, we find out that Joseph's response is what you intended for evil, God has turned to good. We see a different type of heart, different type of understanding there. Nonetheless, Jacob agrees to allow Benjamin to go after Judah has made the pledge that if any harm falls on him, take it out on me. We begin to see differences in the man that Judah was and the man that Judah is now 20 years later. Well, this comes to a climax at in chapter 43 or chapter 44 as Benjamin is brought to the palace to see Joseph, not knowing who this is, his long-lost brother. The brothers are seated, arranged in order from birthright of the oldest to the youngest. This amazes and astonishes them. How would the ruler be able to do this? How would he know the certain birth order? Joseph gives Benjamin, as far as food, 5 times as much as the other brothers, just to see if this how they would respond to the youngest brother getting the most, and it doesn't seem to catch them off guard. In fact, the end of 43 says that they feasted and drank freely with him. There was no animosity, so it shows another change in their heart and in their spirit. But chapter 44, the climax of the entire story is when the brothers are supposed to be leaving. All brothers are headed back to Jacob, and Joseph has called his servant to place a silver cup in Benjamin's sack. He runs after them. He gets a servant to run after them. They're called back after it is found that the cup is in Benjamin's sack. They've already agreed. Once they were accused, they said, let the person die because we know we've not taken anything. Why would we? And now when the cup is found, it would be a time where Judah and the other brothers are distraught and upset. So what do we see in this passage? As we close out chapter 44, we see the evidence of a changed heart. Let me show you the evidence in this passage. Chapter 44, verse 13, it says, Then they tore their clothes, and when each man loaded his donkey, they returned to the city. And when Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there, and they fell to the ground before him. Now, what we see first and foremost is deep sorrow and pain. Notice the difference in this changed man, Judah, and the other brothers. Notice the difference that takes place. 20 years earlier with Joseph, they tore his clothes, put him in the pit, and did not care what would befall him. In fact, they sell him to Ishmaelites, not caring about his future. In this situation now, where Benjamin has impending doom upon him, they tear their own clothes. We see their sorrow, their heart broken over the situation. The evidence of a changed heart is where at one point they had torn the clothes of another man. Now they were tearing their own clothes out of sorrow and pain. My belief is that they evidenced true change here. Second, at the end of the chapter, verse 33, Judah speaking, who was the one that came up with the plan originally with Joseph. Now Judah speaking to Joseph shares the heartbreaking effect that this would have on Jacob. And here's what he says in verse 33. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. We see sorrow lead them to sacrifice. Judah is willing to be the sacrifice. Judah is willing to be the slave. We see his heart change to where he's willing to endure whatever punishment, whatever discipline that is needed. And he's willing to stay in order for Benjamin to go. Do you see the difference? Now, many times we look at the story of Joseph and talk about Joseph's integrity, as we should. But I want you to see the change in the heart of Judah. Judah would say, I will be the man. I will take his place. And so we see sorrow that leads to sacrifice. But then we see a sacrifice that leads to supplication. Notice in verse 34. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me? for fear that I see the evil that would overtake my father. Meaning he's in supplication, cares for his father, cares that his father, first, is not overtaken by evil, but second, that it would not depress and hurt the heart of his father. Judah says, let me take his place because I care about my father. Contrast this, compare this to the earlier story of Joseph, in which they didn't care how their father turned out. They didn't care that their father would be hurt. They didn't care that Joseph being sold would break the heart of the father. And now their concern, Judah's concern, is I care about how my father will be affected by this. I want to glorify my father. When you see the change in this man's heart, we see a story, a glimpse of the gospel. When we look even at Jesus Christ, the great Savior, the one that would come from the line of Judah, we see Christ's sorrow for the world, that he wept over the world, wept over Jerusalem as he wanted to gather them like a hen gathers her chicks, that he would weep over the suffering of Mary and Martha and with the death of Lazarus, that he would weep because of the pain and sin in this world, that he would cry out even on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That the sorrow that we see even in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating drops of blood, that's the sorrow of our Savior, that he would tear his own clothes for us, that he would become sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God, be clothed in that righteousness. Judah, a man full of sin, regret, and guilt, compared to Jesus Christ, the God-man who was perfect in every way. Jesus was full of sorrow for the sins of the world. And then we see Jesus become the great sacrifice, a sacrifice that Judah could not become, that Joseph could not even become, that no biblical character could be. Jesus became that perfect lamb. And Jesus was not just willing to say that he would go to prison or say that he would die on a cross, but he demonstrated the love of God in actually dying for us. And then we see the supplication, that just as Judah cared about the heart of his own father, that Jesus would say, Father, I have glorified you by accomplishing the work you've called me to do. Even in Isaiah 53, where we know that it pleased God to crush the Son, that Jesus Christ went to the cross ultimately to glorify the Father, ultimately to glorify God. And that resulted in our good and the supplication that came from Jesus to forgive us. The supplication that came from Jesus of it is finished is what provides salvation to us. And so even in this story, the changed heart of Judah represents and shows us the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And now it calls us to be changed too, that we would have a godly sorrow over the world and we would preach the gospel, that we would be willing to go to the ends of the earth to get this news of the gospel to the world, a news where they are held in prison and held in darkness, and we, in preaching the gospel, are able to seek out those who Jesus desires to save, that we would live our lives as living sacrifices, not to earn God's favor, but because of God's love on us, that now we willingly lay our lives down as a sacrifice, and that we would in supplication say, I care about the heart of my Father. That where we once were enemies of God and children of wrath, we didn't care that we hurt God. But now, because we are children of God, that we desire to please him, to simply bring a smile to his face. Genesis 42 through 44 shows not just the life of Joseph, but it shows the change in the heart of his brothers, namely Judah. And may we, with changed hearts, understand the glory and the majesty of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice and walk in that example today. I love you. I'm praying for you. Stakes in the ground.